Okay, welcome everybody in the room and on the screen with us. Welcome to this event with us about, well, technically it's called a conversation with Neha Sanghrajka. It is a conversation with Neha Sanghrajka about some really fascinating mediation successes, especially in Mozambique. So it's also a wonderful occasion to talk about Mozambique, which is a special joy for me to do because the Carr-Ryan Center actually has a special connection to Mozambique, which reminds me that I did not introduce myself. I'm Matthias Risser, I'm the director of the Carr-Ryan Center. The Carr-Ryan Center was once founded or received the founding gift from a man named Greg Carr, the Carr in the Carr-Ryan Center. And Greg has actually since moved on to Mozambique and has so basically shifted his human rights operations to Southeast Africa. And for the last 20 years has been rebuilding a nature park in central Mozambique called Gorongosa. And he thinks of Gorongosa very much as a human rights park because the idea is this is a massive territory smack in the middle of Mozambique. It is a nature park, it's a wildlife park, it's supposed to be sustained eventually through safari. But the idea is that the nature park will have its own integrity, will be sustainable only if the people who live around the park are also integrated, because otherwise they will take what they need from the park, and in that sense there needs to be medical infrastructure, educational infrastructure, all sorts of things that register very much from a human rights standpoint. All of that needs to be built there, and that is what Greg Carr, as in Carr-Ryan Center, has been doing for the last 20 years, and I had the pleasure of visiting him there a couple of years ago. So I've actually seen in action what a human rights park looks like and what this particular one looks like. But this is really also, and there's actually a very specific context also to Neha's work, since one of the major agreements made in the Mozambique peace process, to which Neha was so instrumental, was actually concluded in Gorongosa, which is also speaking to the kind of spiritual importance that Gorongosa National Park has for Mozambique. But before we're getting there, a little bit more about Neha. So Neha Sanghrajka is a Kenyan mediator, negotiator, writer of Indian descent with almost 20 years of experience in some of the world's most consequential peace processes. She played a central role alongside Kofi Annan during Kenya's 2007 electoral crisis, and then more recently she co-led the Mozambique peace process together with the personal envoy of the UN Secretary General, a process that culminated in the 2019 Maputo Accord for Peace and National Reconciliation. That is actually really quite an amazing process in the world of mediation, one that is just insufficiently known in the world as a whole. So yes, indeed, this is widely recognized as a rare and instructive success in contemporary conflict resolution. Neha holds degrees in law and international relations, currently is a fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs right here at Harvard, used to be Yale Peace Fellow, a fellow at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy, and she also serves on the board of the Kofi Annan Foundation and the Berghof Foundation, so foundations concerned with mediation in conflict situations, and she has worked with the United Nations, the African Union, and also the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. So first of all, welcome Neha. Please give her a round of applause for being here with us. And Neha, just tell us a little bit about, so who are you? What does a mediator do? If I wanted to be a mediator when I grow up, what would I have to do starting today?
Thank you very much. And of course, thank you to the Carr-Ryan Center. I don't often do this, but the link with Gorongosa made it almost impossible. Actually, the places where you have peace processes or where you conduct talks, those end up becoming even more special than the moments themselves. And the people who are around you, whether it's a hotel that is holding these talks or, in this case, the park, they became part of the process as much as us. So first of all, thank you very much for that. This wasn't in my career plans. I studied law. I fully intended to go into corporate law, and I had a different trajectory in life. I lived in the UK for many years. In 2000, but there's a great African saying: "Man plans, God laughs." I feel like that totally is applicable to me in my career path. So to answer your question, I don't know how to answer it directly, but I will tell you how I got here. It was more fate than anything else. My father passed away. I had to move back to Kenya to look after the rest of my family, and it just so happened 2 months later, we had our own electoral crisis, which led to 1,000 dead and almost 600,000 displaced, which for Kenya was a lot. Kenya is a stable country in the region, and so for us it was a bit of a shock. The African Union at the time sent Kofi Annan to mediate. He had just left the UN as the Secretary General, and I got my first sort of opportunity to see a peace process up close and personally. And I started working on the Kenya peace process. I did that for 8 years. And by that time, I was sold into not ever wanting to do anything else again. While 80% of conflict resolution is really tough, and you see no hope, it's the 20% that drives me. So I joined, as you said, the HD Center and made my way to Mozambique, a country that I never visited, Portuguese speaking, didn't speak Portuguese, and a completely different context. I wanted to try something different. I went to Mozambique for a very short period, ended up staying 9 years. So again, the trajectory to which life happens, it's not prescriptive.
Let me say a little bit of background on Mozambique before then we turn to your role in that process. So Mozambique, as was already mentioned, used to be a Portuguese colony. There were several Portuguese colonies in Africa. Angola is really the biggest one on the western side, and then Mozambique on the eastern side. And one thing to understand about the Portuguese colonial context is that Portugal basically clung to its colonies with much more urgency and desperation than just about any other European power in the post-war period. So that is why Mozambique only gained independence from Portugal in 1975. Right? That is quite late by standards of African countries gaining independence. And that only after a decades-long and very bitter armed liberation struggle led by a group called Frelimo, that is now that then turned from a sort of Frelimo as a Portuguese abbreviation, as the word for liberation, and there Frelimo has since been the ruling party. And then basically almost immediately after that, the country was plunged into a devastating civil war between Frelimo and this other organization called Renamo with the resistance. It's the resistance movement. And that is something that was basically artificially engineered, first by Rhodesia and then by South Africa. So South Africa did not want to have a functioning black republic in the area and went to enormous lengths destabilizing everybody else down there. So basically immediate transition from 10 years of liberation struggle into another decade and a half of civil war. All of that, so that period alone, the civil war killed roughly 1 million people and left the country in ruins. So Mozambique to this day is one of the poorest countries in the world. And if you visit Mozambique, you also just appreciate the basic fact that poverty really comes in degrees. So in the countryside of Mozambique, basically people, they own by way of clothes basically what they're wearing at the moment. They live in huts. They live literally from day to day. This is incredible poverty, which is why the human rights park concept is so important, because these people need to be integrated into the Gorongosa concept also in order not to take what they need from the park. Right? So all of that is the background. And then what we have is that the Rome General Peace Accords of 1992 ended the civil war part and in principle opened the way to a multi-party democracy. But Renamo never fully accepted defeat in this process. So this is now more than 30 years ago, and they never fully accepted the resulting political marginalization, and there's always been low-level violence around this, and so it required more negotiations to actually make this country functional, and that led to this process that then eventually produced the Maputo. Maputo is the capital of Mozambique, the Maputo Accords of 2019. So this is at the end of a 35-year very bitter struggle. Can you tell us a bit about your role in that? So we now have you in Mozambique. You arrived in Mozambique. How did you get connected to this, and what was your role in this?
Yeah, thank you. So the first thing I did notice almost instantly is something that's not very well sort of known or written about, but actually Renamo, it wasn't that they didn't accept defeat. It was more that the Rome Agreement of 1992 was never fully implemented. So promises were made, but it never came to pass, and that's what led to the disquiet. Basically, with Mozambique, what happened was that it's very centralized, and so public participation was never fully realized. What Renamo wanted was participation into the structures, into provinces where they had won, the ability to govern. For example, one of the first things that we did was the issue of decentralization, where you have previously elected governors appointed by the ruling party, in this case, decentralized, that they were voted on by the people. That was one of the one of the conclusions of the decentralization process. So that's just a little bit of the history, where when you have peace agreements that are negotiated but then never fully implemented, it's already a lost cause, and it's not, the blame is not on one party or the other. It's the situation and the framing of it. When I came to Mozambique, there were two failed processes that I was a part of. One was heavily nationalized. So everyone was Mozambican, even the mediators. There were religious leaders who were of great standing in the community. And there was no international. In fact, I was pretty much the only one, and I kept very low-key advising from really the background. That process went on, and ultimately didn't achieve what it was set out to achieve. And as you mentioned, low-scale violence restarted again with the next elections. With the new president in place, the country then went through another bout of violence. And in this case, the mediation that was set in, or I like to say forced, on the country was what we now colloquially call the Avenida process, as it was held in Avenida Hotel in Maputo. And this was put in place by the European Union, forced on both parties. Neither side really wanted it, or that's how it came to pass. There were 13, I was one of 13 mediators at the table, the only woman, and it was the former president of Tanzania, former president of Botswana, South Africa, the Vatican, I'm kind of losing count now, Sant'Egidio, a lot of people at the table, and I believe that was basically the structure, the formulation. It was set to fail from the start. Learning that lasted about 6 months. For me, they were the most instructive 6 months of my life, because if what I learned in Kenya from Kofi Annan on how to do things, this was a great lesson in how not to do anything. And so I took notes in the middle of like crying every 2 days at how horrible the whole thing was. But that gave birth to something that did work. And so one of the people at the table, Jonathan Powell, who's now the UK's National Security Advisor, and I, we got along very well, and we were like-minded in trying to find a solution. We formed a back channel with the then Swiss ambassador on the ground, basically looking around for anyone in the diplomatic corps who does not like to be front-facing in the media. And the Swiss ambassador, typical to the Swiss, very discreet, very low-key, very humble, and we thought, oh, maybe we could form a team and do something together. So the three of us formed a back channel and started direct negotiations quietly in secret between the president and Lakama, the Renamo leader in the bush. And by the bush, I mean Sofala province, where Gorongosa Park is. That's where the mountain, the famous mountain that I climbed 45 times, it was awful and horrid. So he was hidden in there, and the army was surrounding the base of the mountain. So our first task was to secure a cordon sanitaire to go up the mountain to discuss. One of the things that we put central to the peace process was, instead of bringing the parties to the table, we decided we didn't want a table. Throughout the table, decided we wanted to do everything differently, and there is something very freeing about failure. Because we had already failed, expectations were so low, trust was below zero between everyone and every party, that we could actually be creative and do what we wanted. So we decided we would now go to the parties. So we would go from the presidential palace in Maputo to the bush to the comfort level of Renamo, not the other way around, not to drag them to a city where we were comfortable. We decided to go there, however uncomfortable it might have been for me. And so that started the process where we were able to engage honestly and directly with the leaders with time and patience and listen to exactly what the problems were and where the margins of maneuver were. In the meantime, the Peace Process Secretariat also set up a public process to bring the people of Mozambique on board into formulating the two issues. One was the Memorandum of Understanding of Military Affairs, which was to disarm Renamo, and the other one was decentralization to enhance public participation.
So I have
and so my role, sorry, you mentioned, and so my role was, I was working with Jonathan and Mirko in the beginning, but in the end, Mirko Manzoni, who was the Swiss ambassador, we basically designed the process, negotiated and mediated, two very different things, but very, you can't do one without the other. And so we drove the process from the background, instilling national ownership. So we were never at the front. In fact, it was about 2 years before anybody really knew what I was doing, and really maintained and stayed really in the background, and allowed the spokespeople of the process to be the people themselves.
So maybe just for conceptual clarification, so mediation, negotiation, how do you distinguish them, and then once you distinguish them, can you come back to the statement that you can't really do the one without the other? It sounds like you, in your practice, in one's practice, as either the other also enters. Can you just make this come alive for us a bit more?
Yeah, so this is just my opinion, and I'm sure all the brains at Harvard might disagree, but I actually believe that in practice, what I've seen in Kenya and in Mozambique in the field is that negotiation is every day. You have to negotiate every single day, every single minute for something or the other. And so you can't really have mediation without negotiation, but you can have negotiation without mediation. And so I'll explain a little bit in a clearer way. Negotiating, we would negotiate with the civil society, with the international community. We would negotiate with the government and the presidency. We would negotiate with Renamo, and go back and forth on the positions and what the final solution would be in terms of whatever the topic was. And then when you have your mediation hat, that's a little bit more emotional. So there's a lot more distance that you have to keep, a lot more empathy, because it's not, negotiation is more transactional. It's two people or two parties, and you try and come up with the best way at the time in that sphere. Whereas mediation, you're almost a neutral arbiter. And so how it interspersed on a daily basis and how we kind of wore different hats was we would go back and forth between the two sides negotiating, building confidence, building trust, quietly trying to understand. That was negotiation. And then when there was an enough level, enough comfort, where we thought, okay, well, the two sides agree on this, we can now come together. Then we would arrange meetings together, high-profile ones, to instill confidence in the public, but never before that. Before that, it was always quiet shuttle diplomacy, quiet mediation, quiet negotiation, back and forth, and then comes mediation. So I think that negotiation is an almost integral part of mediation. You can't have one without the other.
Then let's talk about how this all entered into what you were doing with the various parties there, because the one thing just to reiterate is that when your process started, that then eventually led to the Maputo Agreement of 19, that was the third time within a decade that something like this had started, right? So we had a process in 2012, a process in 2016, and they respectively failed because they didn't take root nationally. People's hearts weren't in this sufficiently. But in this case, in your process, that was different. This was very much driven nationally. President Nyusu, who was the Frelimo president, was very much behind this. Renamo leadership was very much behind this. So they had come to a point in this whole process where they realized that there was no way forward here in this hostility, so they wanted to end it. But so the national rooting was there, but then it seems they couldn't or wouldn't quite want to do it just by talking to each other. And of course, the leadership of Renamo was hiding out in the mountain, at Gorongosa mountain, as you say. So what does it mean to be involved as an international actor in such a national process? And how is that a strength? How is that a weakness? How might that sometimes be overstepping the boundaries of propriety?
So there are a lot of threads to pull on that one. I'm going to attempt a few. Beginning with the last one, I think the two failures were quite instrumental in us formulating our own behavior at the process that actually succeeded. And so I do believe now that an overly nationalized process without internationals is not sustainable, because it doesn't provide the neutral element. And then a heavily internationalized one without the parties on board and without the hearts and minds, as you said, that also doesn't work. So you kind of need the best of both worlds. And so we tried to design a process with that in mind. Firstly, what we did was, aside from creating the space, protecting the space, giving time and doing like the back channel and working in a way that allowed people to actually, not rushed. It wasn't rushed, there wasn't a timeline. Apart from all those kind of factors, the other really interesting thing about the Maputo Accord or the Mozambique process was we decided conflict resolution follows a normal trajectory. You have you have the conflict, you have high-level peace talks, there are all these calls for peace, you have the talks, and then you have an agreement signed and then implementation. And it's all kind of cut and dry sequentially. In this case, we decided to do things backwards. We decided, let's start implementing. Never mind signing things. As it is, there was an exhaustion of like the signing, the photographs, the promises. It felt, after 2 failed attempts, it just felt that promises unfulfilled are even worse, for hope. And so to build trust, to do things differently and creatively, we decided to start implementing before signing. And that was a big risk. And I feel like processes need to take measured and calculated risks, keeping people in mind. So what we did was basically start implementing as if there was an agreement. In our minds, we had the agreement formulated and we thought about it, but we never imposed. We never imposed the agreement or anything. We just decided, okay, the first thing we need to do is build trust. So go back and forth, and every time one party came through, the other side, a little bit of the trust would increase, and vice versa. It went on for quite a while. Now this was a big risk, because at the end of the day, at any point in this, the parties could easily say, pull out. And there was nothing on record, there was nothing there. So it was a big risk, but I think that risk was worth taking, purely because at the end of the day, in our minds, we had Mozambique in mind, and that was our only objective. So if there wasn't we weren't focused on having a peace agreement. We weren't really focused on peace itself. We were focused on how to bring about peace in the most sustainable way. We were trying to work ourselves out of a job. So which is very different than you see today, where you have mediators, you have negotiators, you have people in the peace field, but they are the story. They are the central. They're the ones who are out there in front of the cameras. They are giving the statements. We refuse to speak to the press, the public. Any messaging, it had to come from either the president or the ministers or Renamo or the Renamo delegates. This wasn't our process. And so we behaved accordingly. Okay. And I think that went a long way to instilling faith and hope, not only in each other, because even if they doubted each other, they never doubted the peace process or the genuineness of me or Mirko. And climbing up and down that mountain, I mean, when I didn't need to, sorry, I do go on about this a bit, but my colleague was a Swiss mountaineer. It's like a walk in the Sunday park. But I do remember very clearly that the more times I kept going to the mountain and showing up, sometimes showing up is all that matters. I think they thought one of two things. One, she's not going to go away, so we better discuss. And two, I think they were kind of impressed that I was struggling up that mountain. So consistency also matters. And I think that's how we build trust slowly, 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 to the point where in the next election, there was a conflict after the next election. By this time, we had wound up our peace process. But you know what was interesting? Conflict happens all the time. Every election is going to bring about conflict. What was very interesting to us was the way Mozambique managed it and dealt with it. With no international presence, without any sort of help, they immediately, the new president, put together a dialogue forum with all the candidates that were in the election. And so much so that the main person that was contesting the election, I just learned the other day, is part of the state council now, with an active role in advising the government.
So let me just say a couple of things on the mountain. So when you visit the region, you see this largely flat region, right? And so then there's this mountain sticking out, and everybody just explains this to you right away. This is Gorongosa Mountain that's kind of domineering the countryside, is domineering the weather pattern there. So I can honestly say I have been on that mountain.
Oh yeah, you have.
But I took the bus. And it was a completely different scenery. So by that time, I mean scenery as in what they were doing with it. So I went there because we were touring these various components of Gorongosa Park, and also how to make this sustainable as an economic proposition. And as you know, they're growing coffee up there now. So I was being taken to the coffee plantations by bus. But I do appreciate this mountain well enough. So when Neha says building trust, how many times have you been up there? Like 45 times, you said?
46.
46, yeah, sorry. Last time you said 45.
Did I? Okay, 46.
Anyway,
I'll add one every
I
time.
can totally see the mechanism of that. I mean, the credibility that comes just from doing that, I can totally see that.
But also, Matthias, now that you've mentioned this mountain, you went by bus.
Yeah.
But 10 years ago,
I'd advise everybody to take the bus.
10 years ago, when I started out in Mozambique, there wasn't a way to go by bus. Well, first of all, there was an active conflict. Second, the roads were not what they are today. In the last 7 or 8 years, the roads have massively been built up. So much so that when I first went there was only one road linking the top to the bottom. And so, for example, one journey for me back then would have been flying to the nearest city, Beira, taking a car to the nearest city, which is Gorongosa, and then climbing for 7 hours. Yeah, and not just climbing, sort of literally hoisting your way up every 2 seconds, So it was proper climbing. And so that, and that was long, just for one meeting, for 20 minutes, that's what we would do. Sometimes we would come back down from the mountain at 3 in the morning, talk about the risks and analysis there. So all those log frames went out the window. And in addition to that, what I wanted to say is that when the conflict was raging, the other thing we wanted to do is, instead of talking about peace, we wanted to show peace. So what we kind of negotiated, mediated, convinced Renamo to do, and at that time Lakama, was to move the conflict to just one side of the mountain, to leave the other side of the mountain free. And we convinced the army to do the same, and it took about a year. Now, why did we do that? We did that because we wanted to show what life could be like in peace times. And in the time that we were still negotiating, because you talk about peace dividends, but how often do you really see them with your own eyes? And in this case, with the help of the park and with the society around, that part of the mountain that you visited was left free of conflict, and they were able to grow coffee, they were able to reopen the schools, go back to church, etc., etc. When people in the villages, they saw the potential on the other side, half our work was done. We had won the hearts and minds when people could see a life beyond that. So sometimes you have to believe in peace more than the people themselves, and you have to find a way to show concretely and tangibly what it could look like.
So let's go back to the weeds of the mediation process. So there's one concept that you like using is peace listening. Peace listening. You place that at the heart of this process, and that phrase does a lot of work in your thinking and also your writings about this. Can you just explain to us a little bit more what is peace listening, and what can people take away from your approach to peace listening?
Yeah, it almost transpired almost by accident. In all the hours and hours and hours spent listening to both sides, mostly in the mountain, in the bushes, in the fields, we developed a habit of, as now I coin it, peace listening, and it was basically listen, not to respond. If you think about it, nowadays we listen to whether it's a conversation or negotiating something, but we listen, but half our brain is geared to respond. What are we going to say next? In this case, again, there's a lot more freedom in just listening for the sake of it, without an objective, without a nice answer pre-prepared, with no judgment, and just sort of listen without an agenda, listen without a solution. Most of the time, people just want to be heard. And in conflict situations, they want to tell their story. They have a right, they want the right to tell their story. Whatever that story is, whether you agree with it or you don't agree with it, it's important to listen to it. Listening doesn't mean acquiescence, listening doesn't mean agreement, but listening simply means that I acknowledge that you have the right to think the way you do and feel the way you do. And the more we did it, the more we realized that maybe we could tweak our ways. Maybe we didn't know that this might have been a better solution, that might have been a better solution. And so basically I would coin it, or I would describe it as listening without an agenda, listening without a reason to formulate a response. And it frees up the brain quite a lot when you have no pressure to formulate a solution. And sometimes the solution comes from within anyway.
And one part of that solution was this, you touched on that, the implementing implementing while negotiating still, right? So this is quite remarkable achievement that Renamo started disarming before there had been a formal agreement on anything, so kind of turning around the classic order of things. Can you explain a little bit more, how did that come about, and did that also have certain risks attached to it?
In this case, actually, it was the other side. It was the government that took the risk. The two issues were, one, the wish of the government, or Frelimo, was that Renamo must disarm. You can't have a party in parliament and then also have a party carrying guns. So the African Union is at 2065 or 2063, silencing the guns initiative. Mozambique is now the first example of that. And so that was the wish of the government in terms of the Memorandum of Understanding on Military Affairs, how to disarm Renamo and do the DDR process, to carry it out to its completion. And on the other side, the Renamo wanted to redo the constitution to embed elected governors, which simply means that if they win in their province, whichever, there are 11 provinces in Mozambique, then they have, the governor comes from the party that won. Because of, it was more a timetable thing, because of you can only change the constitution every 5 years, the bill in parliament had to come before the agreement to disarm. And so there we really had to negotiate and convince the government, and the government had to convince its constituencies to have faith that Renamo would disarm. You know, and that's where the implementation before signing anything really came in handy, because we had by this time we had bought ourselves enough credit, enough trust in ourselves. So when we said, look, let this go through, let's work on this first because of this constitutional deadline. We understand the risk, we understand what will happen if you pass this in parliament and then Renamo doesn't disarm, but have faith in us. And that mattered a lot, because that was the credibility of Mirko, who then became the UN envoy for Mozambique, and myself and the whole PPS. We promised that this would happen. And the way we had conducted ourselves up to this point, there was enough faith in the peace process. We had protected the process enough. And I remember it was really joyous. For the first time in the history of the country, they had every single person voted for changing the constitution. It was unanimous. This never happened before. And it was really, but the next day, almost immediately, we went back to work, and we started working on getting the agreement and negotiating the Memorandum of Understanding of Military Affairs. And 3 months later, it was signed in Gorongosa Park on the 1st of August. On the 6th of August was the peace agreement. And then we spent 3 years doing a DDR process for Renamo. And again, the DDR process was completely unique, very different. We did look at all the books and the practices and all the best practices, but we decided, you know what, this is working for us so far, being innovative and different and sui generis. Let's now design a peace process that works for Mozambique. And the basis of that DDR process was dignity. We wanted to disarm with dignity.
So I have a couple of more questions for you, but one more thought on the Gorongosa involvement. So if you visit Gorongosa, you see there's a lot of photographs of the ceremony, right? Also, the presence of these people, the leadership, and how they went about it, and that was a great moment for Gorongosa. I mean, it's also cementing Gorongosa's spiritual status for Mozambique, but it's also really it created stability, safety, security for Gorongosa itself, because this is a nature park that basically goes back to Portuguese colonial times, right? So the Portuguese put this park there just like in the British colonies down there. There's Kruger National and other parks in Zambia and Zimbabwe. This was kind of a thing to do in Southern Africa during colonial times, right? As a kind of nature reserves for also hunting. So this goes back to Portuguese times, but then the park was completely destroyed during all the fighting, the liberation struggle, the civil war. So, and what that means is basically all the animals were killed, partly for food, partly for sport, right? So when Greg Carr went there to rebuild that as a park, he had to basically repopulate, all these various species, all the larger species there. Yeah. And much of the many of the natural resources were otherwise also claimed, right? As happens in war, in particular wood for fire, and wood is a very scarce resource in that climate anyway. So there was a big day for Gorongosa, creating a possibility for rebuilding.
Yeah, and actually, now that you mentioned that the park and the animals, I remember it's also the first time I saw traumatized elephants. So when you have elephants have long memories, oh yeah, they do, and they pass it on generation to generation. The elephants in Kenya are nice. Yeah. They won't chase you. You don't see anger in either Tanzania or Kenya in the elephant population. And I've been on like 1,000 safaris, of course, in the comfort of a nice safari vehicle. But however, in Gorongosa, when we were walking up and down the mountain, one of the things was, apart from the Mozambican spitting cobra, and then there was this plant or leaf that you're not supposed to touch, it's poisonous, or a whole bunch of things out there in the wild. One of the things was the elephants, and it was quite scary because you can really see that the aggression and the aggressiveness. And so we were told by a lot of the rangers are from Zimbabwe, which is just across the border. Yeah. And we were told by the rangers that the elephants here you have to be very careful, you can't behave like you do in Kenya. Oh. And so I learned massive lessons.
I'm surprised they survived.
Huh?
I'm surprised they survived.
Yeah, and also the first time in my life, and I grew up, my high school in Kenya was opposite Nairobi National Park. Nairobi it's the only city that has a national park within its borders. So like I'd be sitting up in math class or English class and look out the window and it's the national park, you see animals. And I've never seen a three-legged lion, and in Gorongosa so many. So again, with the mines, because there were a lot of mines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my remaining two questions.
Sorry, I keep interrupting.
No. So one is on gender inclusion. One thing that you are fond of saying is that during this process in Mozambique, gender inclusion was practiced rather than preached. Which is by itself an interesting formulation, because there's also this implicit criticism of other contexts where gender is mentioned, where then it seems to be more preached than practiced, right? So tokenism. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more what did that mean actually, that gender was practiced rather than preached?
Well, look, I feel the same about gender that I do about inclusion and all these other things that you have to do to tick boxes. Not to say it's not important, but I think there's a way to do it which is again sustainable and not just to tick a box. And so when I say we practiced it rather than dictated, the worst thing you can do to any other human being, whoever they are, is to teach, to be pedantic, to teach, or to have a kind of arrogant attitude that you know best. Because at the end of the day, mediation, negotiation, all of these things are about the human condition and how you want to be treated. So in terms of gender inclusion, in terms of like normal inclusion, we did it strategically rather than enforced inclusion, because enforced inclusion is not real. And so a couple of quick examples. When we had the committees for DDR, for the working groups to formulate either the Decentralization Commission, the DDR commissions, instead of saying that you need a woman representative, we let people do what they want. If they're women on either side, fine. If they're not, then they're not. But from the Peace Process Secretariat, we would send women. We would make sure our office is balanced, gender balanced, and we would make sure we have parity in senior leadership within the Peace Process Secretariat, which was about 40 people in total that we led. And every time there was a meeting, instead of sending a male, we would send a female. And initially there was pushback. Oh, DDR is not a woman's business, you know, you've never held a gun, what do you know about anything, etc., etc. But instead of saying no, instead of pushing back and giving the impression that you're teaching and being just not very nice, we would just say, okay, well, we'll postpone the meeting. No problem. At the moment, we only have women available. So when there's a man available, and we know that they're not going to postpone. People are not going to postpone meetings, and so you just again, like the coffee, half of the mountain with the coffee, you just show. You are who you are, and people learn from example. So what we did was we would always do what we want to do according to our values, and according to our own sense of what was right and wrong. And over time, we saw this change. So much so that now, after like, let's say 10 sessions of a meeting, they didn't want anyone. They wanted my colleague Finia, or they wanted my colleague Ifa, or they wanted my colleague Lily. So, you know, slowly, over time, it just came to pass. But yeah, and the same with inclusion. We never put everyone at the same table. There's a big rush for people today to be on the table. We need to get rid of this table. What we did was more strategic inclusion. In the beginning, yes, it was only the leaders, because the conflict is between the two leaders. You have to start somewhere. It's kind of like being in front of a doctor's office and you have cancer or something. Are you going to say all your personal things to a waiting room full of people? No. Conflict is deeply personal. These issues are deeply personal. So the solution has to also be deeply personal and has to be respected in that way. We brought everyone on board strategically, sequentially, and when it was right. From whether there were members of parliament, religious leaders, civil society, but not like your classic peace process where everyone is at the table and then people are happy that it's an inclusive process which leads nowhere. So those are my feelings on gender inclusion, and they're not very popular with donors, I can tell you that. But in the end, results matter, and this process should be replicated, because the values with which they were conducted, they make sense in anywhere in the world.
On that note, so making sense everywhere in the world. So there's a fascinating question here: how much there is to learn from what you achieved in Mozambique, how things unfolded in Mozambique, and it's interesting that now you say so certain aspects make sense everywhere in the world, right? But then there's also one thing that I kept thinking is this, this famous Tolstoy quote, right? About how every happy family looks alike and every unhappy family is unhappy in its very own way, right? Every conflict is different. Yeah. Is personal, has a history, has a story, is different, requires a different take, a different approach. So how much is there to learn for the how much can be distilled from what you achieved in Mozambique for general lessons for the rest of us?
So I've been thinking about this with what's going on in the world, and so many conflicts and many misunderstandings, almost on every continent. I actually think that there is no danger in replicating all the process. Not so much, yes, every process is sui generis, every process is different. I get that, and context matters. But what is the same, what is universal, is how we treat each other, on what basis do we engage with each other? And if the Mozambique process was conducted in an innovative way, new, you throw out the rule book, you don't go on old frameworks, you try different things, you design a process with dignity, humility, with patience. You have all the values, all the things that we brought to the process and how we conducted that. I think that could, and also the confidentiality and secrecy in the back channel. I think that can be replicated. There isn't a conflict today that would not benefit from these kind of behaviors if they became normative. One major thing that I would say that is that can be used almost anywhere is ego. If you find people who will leave their ego at the door, that's already like a massive step and a massive difference. Because most of the negotiations, most of the mediations, they're centered around people. They're centered around egos. Their victims or people are the last on the list. And so, I mean, there's so many facets to the Mozambique peace process, but even if you take what I've said today and apply them today to any other conflict, I think it would make the world a better place.
That is a good note to open up to your questions and contributions. And how are we doing things with the mic? Should I use this mic, or do we have another mic? Okay. So if you feel comfortable, introduce yourselves. Since we are recording, I'm not asking, but let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Victoria. I'm an MPP1 here. My background is in Northern Ireland, which also has a very interesting peace process. And what I was I'm very interested in like the idea of a sustainable peace process and what the results are, like decades down the line. What I was really struck by in Northern Ireland is how issues that were unresolved in 1998 were really causing problems still today. So I just wondered if you could talk through how you balance like leaving some things unanswered in order to reach like a definitive outcome, and whether you like how you make the judgment of when that's right to do, and whether there were things that kind of you like are unresolved still that you think might be a problem down the line.
So what we did, one of the things that was not resolved or even spoken about, there were two things actually that come to my mind that were personal to me. One was the women and children in 1992 were not taken care of. The UN process in 92 took care of all the men and the combatants, but the women and children were left without nothing. And so I remember that as one of the lessons from 92. And when we designed this peace process, we designed the DDR not only centered around the particular ex-combatant, but around the family, the women and children, and also the societies that they would go back into. And I'd say that was a success in terms of just having a more sustainable resolution. In terms of one major thing that we did not, it's not in the peace agreement, is the issue of pensions. Now, the issue of pensions, that has never ever been, if we had put that into the peace agreement or as part of the talks from the outset, they wouldn't have gone anywhere because it's a highly emotive subject. What Renamo wanted, the reintegration part of Renamo, yes, you reintegrate the combatants into society, but then what? And one of the biggest things is they want to, if you are to be a legitimate member of society, which is what we wanted, they have to be given pensions. You have to pay pensions to their perception of themselves as soldiers and not combatants, right? And so for the government, this is very difficult. And actually, Mozambique is the only process, or the Maputo Accord, sorry, is the only process that has succeeded in the government paying pensions to the opposition, paying pensions to the Renamo soldiers. It's been thought about and discussed in other countries, in West Africa and in Colombia, but never ever achieved. And so what we did was, we always knew that that was something pending from 92 and also the 2013 and 2015 agreements and 2016. But we decided that that is another thing that we would take up, and it was almost a separate negotiation for almost 4 years within the process, where we finally, there was enough trust built for the government to pass a decree in Parliament that accorded Renamo soldiers pensions.
So Northern Ireland, so if I may just ask you a question back, is a fascinating reference point, right? So when you were listening to this, were there things where you said this was very similar in Northern Ireland and this was completely different, or?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So what I used to work on was the transitional justice reconciliation aspect, and that was the thing that was really, like, there was no mechanism in the Good Friday Agreement to resolve that, and so people still feel very strongly about, you know, like prosecuting paramilitary actors, but also state actors who might have been involved, and that's like a very difficult thing for the government to pass legislation on, like prosecuting veterans, prosecuting people who aren't in the intelligence community. And so it's really interesting what you say about like the trust building process, because Northern Ireland over the last like 20 years has had like a lot of rounds of negotiations to try and resolve this issue, and to be honest, it's still not resolved. And I think the question is like, how do you build trust? How do you bring people into a place where they can let things go that they feel like really, really strongly about, and they're happy to either compromise on it or accept an agreement, even if it doesn't give them exactly the answer that they want. So it'd be, yeah, interesting to hear your thoughts on whether there were like specific things that allowed that trust to be built, or whether it's just something that you have to allow time to like wash over. Because sometimes that's I kind of felt like time just passed, and then like eventually people who like even feel strongly about it like die, and so they're not even at the table anymore. Like, is that the way that things have to go? It'd just be, yeah, interesting to get your thoughts.
Not so much only time, but again the approach, again the way to do it. We were always very honest. We never ever lied about anything. If something couldn't be achieved, we would be honest. If many times we had to say things that were unpalatable to both leaders or either leader. Again, this also takes. You build trust by having your own sense of integrity, right? In terms of when you spoke about transitional justice, this was of course an issue that was quite huge. It was also mentioned a lot by the Western countries. It was a feature of that because obviously people had died, justice, victims, etc., etc. We took a different approach, similar to gender and inclusion. We also took a similar approach to this issue. We decided at the same time as all of this was happening to consult all the African ambassadors for examples and good practices, all the Western ones, and then we went around, we sent a team around to all the Renamo combatants. There were 5,221. And then there was a military junta that had separated from them. That was another whole mediation on itself. But we sent them around and to the communities to discuss the issue of justice, transitional justice, what they wanted to see. Now Mozambique had a good example from South Africa, and the South African TRC, the Truth Commission, Desmond Tutu, they did not want that. I, from my own experience in Kenya, had the TGRC, the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, and I saw all too well how the implications of that. And so it was interesting. The Western ambassadors had one point of what transitional justice looks like, and the African ones had another, and Mozambicans had another. So we designed a process that suited the Mozambicans, which is why now I'm confident that actually, whether you agree or disagree, I didn't agree with a lot of what was done or not done. But at the end of the day, it's the process of the people of the country. Rwanda dealt with it a different way, as you well know. Northern Ireland, I think, didn't deal with it very well. But it is what it is, and I think there are lessons to be learned from all of this. And what we did not want to do is impose a process or impose a Western viewpoint on a country that didn't want it.
Hugh, and then I'm going to go to the front row.
My name's Hugh Doherty. I teach leadership here at the Kennedy School. I'm from Northern Ireland. I was raised in conflict, so I want to build off your question. Neha, thank you for your presence and your story. You deserve a medal, and I think of those 46 7-hour trips for 50-minute meetings. should be a special reward. But the question I have is, it gets back to this issue of implementation. Like Victoria was saying, you know, they had a peace agreement in Northern Ireland 27 years ago, and immediately afterwards these what we call peace walls went up. They're 20 feet high,
Yeah.
about 100 of them separating.
I visited them.
You saw them,
Yeah.
separating Catholic Protestant communities. So on the one hand, you know, it prevents killing, but on the other hand, 27 years later, when they do a survey on each side of the wall, 80% of people say we love those walls to come down, but 80% on each side, but we don't trust them. So that implementation piece, you know, the leadership required for that, the next moment after the agreement is missing. And I see this everywhere, you know. So I'm curious about how this is in Mozambique, in terms of, you know, you got the agreement, but the implementation process, how does that get managed?
So actually, it was those walls that made me really think about how to design it in Mozambique differently, because of course, you know, as you mentioned, there was a 17-year civil war, and so there are people that saw them each other as the enemy, and so how do you build trust in a way that that trust, however fragile it is, allows for positive change? We did two things. One was, you know, the world has a very robust development sector. Most of the countries, every single country has their version of either DFID, USAID, etc., etc. And so there's a lot of international partners in the country doing things in various parts of the country. What we did is, because the DDR process was specific and tailored to each single combatant, we knew where those combatants would want to go. So one of the questions on the survey was, where do you want to go after you leave the bush? Bearing in mind that some of these people have been lost in the bush for decades. And so, in fact, I was walking and there was one soldier, I was eavesdropping on conversation between two soldiers behind me on one of these long treks. And one of them was actually saying to the other, oh, I'm worried that my kids will not recognize me. Do you think the peace process would pay for a DNA test to prove that I'm the father? Like, these are the kind of conversations that went through. That's how long they were in the bush. And so we knew where they were going, where they wanted to go. And we realized that we needed to prep the community with something more than just words and goodwill. And so instead of recreating projects, instead of recreating processes, we decided to utilize what was in the country. We set up a reintegration network. And if, for example, Switzerland were building 5 wells in XYZ, we would get them to change that and build those wells in the places the Renamo combatants wanted to go back. So it was just forward thinking, and it was more strategic. So we did that over time, and when the communities saw all the changes taking place, whether it's like a mobile clinic or it's a mobile clinic, whether it's any kind of good thing that's happening in that community, they would link that to the peace process and link that to the combatants coming back. So then suddenly they're not seen as a burden, but they're seen as just another Mozambican who's coming back. And so we started doing that. And then the other parts of this were, of course, messaging. We had unified messaging from the top all the way to the district commanders. So the messaging on the peace process is number one. Today with X, with Facebook, with WhatsApp, with like stuff that even I don't know, Snapchat, whatever it is, there are so many methods of communication out there that there's a lot of room for manipulation. And in the case of Mozambique, we had a very, very strong policy of communication. So if there was a mayor going to another part, the talking points would be the same. And now, on the off chance, it doesn't mean that much, but if you do it over a sustained number of years, it becomes practice. And so that's why the reconciliation was also a little bit tweaked to bear in mind these certain realities that affected only Mozambicans in the rural areas.
Moving to the front row.
Thank you so much for this amazing story. My name is Irina. I'm the mid-career MPA here at question. You mentioned the role of the woman in the peace building process. I believe the latest stats is that only one peace building initiative out of 10 has women at the table, and exactly for the disadvantages that you just mentioned. But are there any advantages of being a woman in the peace building process? That's one. And second, talking to the same people, more or less on the same subject, and listening to most likely the same stories for years, it requires an enormous strength of character. And I wonder what kept you at night motivated to stay neutral, to stay engaged enough, not to get too close, because we are all human beings, right? But not to get too close, but not to be detached from the process as well for so many years, apart from that deep belief in the possibility of peace.
So the first one on women, yes, they are. But things will always go better if you have equal numbers of men and women engaged in something, on both sides. You know, processes with only women will go nowhere. Processes with only men will go nowhere. But I think that the importance of having women at the table, so to speak, although I don't like this proverbial table, is simply that you exist, that you're there. You don't have to, if people see women engaged in peace talks, it gives a different kind of image in mind, rather than just of being the victim, being the mothers, being the victims of a conflict. No, they should be seen as the solutions to the conflict. For example, I never kind of like think of myself as a woman mediator or negotiator, a woman lawyer, woman doctor, woman anything. It's the other way around. It's a doctor, lawyer who happens to be a woman, And I think that kind of conditioning is very, very important for the younger generation. Because I know that just by virtue of me and Mirko always being at the same table, negotiating the same things, speaking the same language, so to speak, even if I wasn't speaking about so-called women's issues, and I wasn't the one who was talking about what was important to gender or anything like that, it could be him doing it one day, it could be me, but the very fact that I was there reminded everybody that 50% of the world is one gender, and so you have to accommodate everyone. And if you really want a process to include all, then you should have a process that is representative. And this also goes old, young. It's not really about women or men. I also have similar views on the old and the young, educated, not so educated, like everything, right? It has to be fair. So we try to make the process as fair as possible. And then your second question was on...
What kept you at night?
Oh, yeah.
Motivated, yeah.
I wasn't always neutral. Like there were times that I was frustrated with one side and the other side, and then other times I was frustrated here. Most of the time when I was climbing that mountain, I was thinking, this isn't even my country, why am I doing this? This is exhausting. I wasn't always, there were moments where I was back and forth. Many times I wanted to go home or just quit, right? But here's what kept me going. What kept me going is two things. In Kenya, when the height of the crisis in Kenya, it was going very badly, the talks. And Kofi Annan threatened to leave the country. He said, I can't do anything more, I'm leaving. And I remember the talks were held at the Serena Hotel, and I remember being in the lobby. I was only 26 at the time. And I remember being in the lobby, and this minister who was one of the parties on the government side, he came up to me and he says, Neha, you can't let Kofi Annan leave. He said, this is the only country we have. I only have one passport. My children are Kenyan. We have no option. They can leave, but we have to stay. And that has always remained with me. And the same with Mozambique. When the Avenida process was failing miserably, I had a conversation with a Mozambican on the other side. At that time, I didn't really speak very much Portuguese, but the English-speaking one. And I was asking him, and I remember this one thing he said. He said, look, we know our place in the world. We know that we might not be as important as the bigger countries or the bigger conflicts. And I remember this one sentence, but why is it when Kenya is in trouble, the international community sent Kofi Annan? And when Mozambique is in trouble, this is the mess you sent? And I was thinking, and he said, don't we deserve better? And so I realized something very, I realized that I have a way out, but those people in the bush, they don't. I can get on a plane and go to another country, but they don't. And so I have nothing to complain about. That won't be fixed with a glass of wine, you know? So yeah, I didn't intend to stay that long. I definitely never imagined that this would be my career or anything like that. And it was very hard at times. But as I said, the 80% that was awful, the 20% make up for it. Because one of the moments I will never forget is the day after the agreement was signed, the one in Gorongosa, I was part of a coffee tour as a tourist. I put on my nice disguise and I went around with a group of tourists to look around at the coffee. And the guide who was taking us around, he didn't know me or my colleague were actually mediating or had anything to do with the peace process. And he was telling the tour group, oh, half of the mountain is open, the children are going back to school, and he was recounting the feelings on how that mountain came alive the day after the peace agreement. And that's when I realized something as small as that has such a massively big impact. And I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I think that rush and that feeling of satisfaction, that's not something that you get every day. And that's what kept me going. That and having a great team. I couldn't have done it without the people I was around. So select your next co-workers very carefully.
I think I saw two more hands. Let's take them. You, Lou, first, and then Carlotta, and then we take those together, and then you get the last word.
I'm Lilia. I'm a research fellow at MIT, and I'm a journalist, and I come from Russia. And throughout your truly inspiring speech, I couldn't help but think about Russia-Ukraine talks. And as a professional, what's your take on what's happening inside the talks? You mentioned that some of the negotiation processes that are happening right now seem like more like a media circus than like people truly trying to reach an agreement. Like it's like as a person, like I have to cover the talks sometimes as a journalist, and like that's my constant impression from the talks. But I wasn't actually intending to ask you about that, but I'm just so anxious about what's happening. Inside this negotiation process, that I wanted to ask, like, what's your opinion? What's happening? Is there a silver lining? Like,
let's get to the last question and also.
My name is Carlotta. I'm a student here at Harvard Kennedy School, and what stuck with me was that you said that people must let their ego at the door, leave their ego at the door. And I was wondering, with diplomacy that increasingly seems to be centered around the leader's self-image, where do you see that we still have a window of opportunity and that we have more responsibility for the middle powers, or where do you see anything that we can do with this upwards trend?
So I'll start with your question. I mean, I think the whole world is following that conflict. I think sadly, watching it just from afar, as I've been doing, I think that the people in those talks have made up their minds, and that's the issue. Both sides have made up their minds and they have their arguments ready. There's not much peace listening going on there, or listening of any kind. It's basically there to both sides come in with the position already articulated or already formulated, with no intention of backing down one way or the other. The international community in this regard also doesn't help, because they also have big sides, and they have formulated their opinion. And the rest of it is that both sides are advancing and continuing based on justifying those initial positions, if that makes sense. And so you've already made up your mind who's right, who's wrong, who's the victim, who's the victor, who's the antagonist. You put labels on everything, and the more labels you put on everything, the worse it is to come to an agreement, because those labels then start to define the approach. So I don't know, I can't answer your question in the way that what will happen or won't happen, but we definitely need to see a leadership change across the world. It's not only those two countries, it's all across the world there is a deficit, and people, somehow everyone has forgotten about ordinary people, because they're bearing the brunt of it, right? With the Russia-Ukraine situation, I think it is solvable. But I think it's only solvable if people go into it with an open, clear mind, with an objective to make peace, rather than justify their initial positions of right and wrong. To be very sure of something is very dangerous as well in this field. And then to your question, I mean, these are difficult questions. I don't do this very often. But I think the ego is a big thing. I mean, I've worked with massive egos, as you can imagine, from a very young age. I've been around world leaders. I have seen things. Funny enough, it's the egos of the middle level which are worse than the actual leaders. Leaders are not so problematic. It's the next layer down that is extremely difficult to move in one way or the other. But on a more serious note, I actually do believe that now is a good time for change. Now is a good time where everything is rupturing. While rupturing is not necessarily a good thing and it is very depressive, it is also an opportunity for people to show leadership, people you wouldn't expect, people to rise up in a way that would be unfathomable, 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So there is opportunity. I mean, I'm an optimist, and this is why I'm here. I think it's easy to be a pessimist. It's much more harder to be an optimist. I'm an optimist for two reasons. One, I can count on my hands. I can count the number of times that people have said definitively that this will never happen in Mozambique, this will never happen in Kenya, this will never happen in XYZ, and then you see it happening. So yeah, I wouldn't say all is lost, but I would say that it's time to remove all the frameworks that we've been using. If you have children, you have a 2-year-old and you give the child a dress meant for a 6-year-old, that kid's gonna drown. Alternatively, if you give the child a dress meant for a baby, it's too tight. What I'm trying to say is that we need to do away with all the frameworks that we've been using since the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and start something new, start something different, dare to be different, dare to be innovative. And I guess the university is as good a place to do these kind of things.
It's a very powerful way of ending, Neha. And you said a lot of just strikingly wise things in passing, and one that I will take home with me is how in scenarios where 80% is awful, the 20% that's not makes it all worthwhile. And I think this actually characterizes a lot of stuff that we do here at the Kennedy School, right? Not at the Kennedy School, of course, where everything is wonderful, but the kind of thing that that people at the Kennedy School are doing out in the wild, right? In real, real life problem solving is exactly of this nature. So thank you for sharing a lot of insight and wisdom of these processes in Mozambique and beyond with us. Neha, thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity as well. It has been a pleasure, and thank you for your time. You guys have been super patient.
Thank you.